US President Donald Trump hosted Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban at the White House in a bilateral meeting that placed the issue of Russian oil sanctions at the center of US-Hungary relations. The discussion comes amid mounting pressure from the United States to reduce European dependence on Russian energy and Hungary's request for relief from sanctions linked to purchases of Russian oil. At a press briefing in Washington as the two leaders met, President Trump said, "We are looking at it because it is very difficult for him to get the oil and gas from other areas." As you know, they don't have the advantage of having sea. It's a great country. It's a big country. But they don't have sea. They don't have the ports. That statement referenced Hungary's geographic disadvantage as a landlocked country and its limited access to maritime energy supply routes. Hungary's heavy reliance on Russian oil and gas, primarily via pipelines rather than seaborne shipment, has been flagged by US and European analysts as a structural vulnerability in the energy transition away from Moscow. Background: Hungary has for years maintained a strong relationship with Russia in the energy sector, acquiring both crude oil and natural gas from Moscow via pipeline networks. Because of its landlocked status and the configuration of its refinery infrastructure, Hungary has argued that switching away from Russian supply is technically and financially difficult. In October 2025, Prime Minister Orban publicly announced his intention to seek an exemption from US sanctions on Russian oil companies covering Hungary's imports, stating that the country is dependent on those transport routes through which energy can reach Hungary. These are mostly pipelines. He added that he needed the Americans to understand this peculiar situation if we want them to allow exemptions from the American sanctions against Russia. These remarks came as the US imposed sweeping sanctions on Russian oil producers, including Rosneft and Lukoil, in late October, aimed at cutting off revenue to Moscow in support of Ukraine. The sanctions raised questions about Hungary's ability to continue purchasing Russian crude without facing secondary US penalties. Meeting in Washington, the November 7 meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Orban thus took place under this backdrop. According to Reuters, Hungary's intention was to discuss a path to a US-Russia meeting and seek exemptions from US energy sanctions. Meanwhile, the White House indicated broader discussions were on the agenda, including possible US-Hungarian cooperation in economic and energy sectors. Hungarian officials travelled to Washington with a sizable delegation and emphasised that they were working on a large economic and energy cooperation package that would greatly contribute to guaranteeing Hungary's long-term energy security. The visit was described in Hungarian media as occurring during a so-called Gilded Age for bilateral relations between the two countries. During the meeting, President Trump reiterated his public agenda to push European nations away from Russian oil imports, noting that he expected them to act. He again pointed to Hungary's logistical challenges and indicated the US was looking at the request for exemption, though he did not formally announce one at the meeting. Hungary's energy dependency available data show that Hungary in 2024 relied on Russia for approximately 74% of its natural gas and 86% of its oil. That heavy dependence has left the country vulnerable to supply disruption and external political pressure. The IMF has warned that an EU-wide cut-off of Russian gas could lead to output losses in Hungary of more than 4% of GDP. Hungary's refineries were built principally to process Russian Urals crude oil, and alternatives such as LNG from other suppliers would require substantial new infrastructure investment. Hungary's government has stressed that seeking an exemption is not a matter of preference, but of national security. In a state radio interview, the Prime Minister said that cutting off Russian oil and gas would cause the economy to drop by 4% immediately. The Hungarian economy would be on its knees. At the same time, Hungary remains at odds with the European Commission's plan to phase out all Russian gas and LNG imports by the end of 2027, maintaining that the phase-out is unrealistic for its country, given its geographic and infrastructure constraints. US objectives and leverage from the US perspective. President Trump has made clear that halting or curbing Russian energy exports is a crucial lever to weaken Russian President Vladimir Putin's financial ability to sustain the war in Ukraine. He has publicly stated on multiple occasions that the war could end if all NATO countries stop buying oil from Russia. The US has imposed sanctions on Russian energy companies and extended its pressure beyond military or diplomatic dimensions into energy and economic policy. Hungary's request for exemption thus places Washington in a delicate position. On the one hand, the US is seeking to maintain the momentum of punitive pressure on Moscow. On the other hand, Hungary is a NATO ally and has a personal rapport with the president. That duality gives Hungary potential leverage, yet the White House and US officials face questions about consistency and strategic precedent should they grant an exemption. Key issues and stakes. The meeting posed several key questions. Will the United States grant Hungary a formal exemption from the sanctions on Russian oil, and what conditions would apply? What economic and energy cooperation deals might Washington seek from Budapest in exchange for such relief? Analysts suggest that the Hungarian delegation may offer to increase imports of US-supplied liquefied natural gas or to deepen US-Hungary defense or nuclear cooperation. How will an exemption affect US messaging to other allies and partners, especially those under pressure to wean off Russian energy? What will the European Union's response be if one member state is seen to receive preferential treatment in the energy sanction regime? For Hungary, the meeting is high stakes domestically. Prime Minister Orban is facing a national election in 2026, and a breakthrough in Washington could bolster his political standing. Conversely, a weak result could trigger criticism at home. Remarks and outcomes. In his remarks to reporters at the White House, President Trump indicated an openness to the idea of exemption, citing Hungary's energy supply constraints. We are looking at it because it is very difficult for him to get the oil and gas from other areas. As you know, they don't have the advantage of having sea. He confirmed the country is a great country, emphasizing the US view of Hungary as an important ally. While the White House did not announce any immediate decision on the exemption, officials indicated that the leaders would discuss areas of mutual interest, including potential deals spanning various industries, according to one US official. Hungary's government contemporaneously signaled that energy security would be a prominent focus of the talks. Hungary's earlier requests and public commentary had already raised the possibility of an exemption. For example, on October 31, Orban said he would ask for the exemption and argued that Hungary's landlocked geography made it particularly dependent on pipeline-based Russian energy imports. The Prime Minister said, "We have to make the Americans understand this peculiar situation if we want them to allow exemptions from the American sanctions against Russia." Implications: the outcome of these negotiations may set a precedent. If Hungary receives an exemption, other nations heavily dependent on Russian energy might seek similar treatment, potentially complicating the US sanctions regime. At the same time, the administration's decision will reflect how it balances energy security, alliance cohesion, and strategic pressure on Russia. For Hungary, any relief would ease the immediate energy supply risk, but would not obviate the need for longer-term diversification. Hungarian analysts note that while alternative supply routes and sources exist, such as LNG from Azerbaijan or Qatar, the transition would require time, investment, and infrastructure adaptation. Moreover, as Hungary's refineries are configured for Russian crude, switching to other blends involves technical and financial costs. Broader context, the meeting also comes in the context of a previously proposed summit between President Trump and President Putin in Budapest, Hungary, which had been announced in October but later cancelled shortly after the US announced the sanctions on Russian oil companies. That summit's collapse adds further context to the urgency and leverage at play in the US-Hungary discussions. The European Union has meanwhile been seeking to phase out dependence on Russian energy. Hungary remains a vocal holdout, citing its dependence and refuting the feasibility of rapid transition given its infrastructure. EU officials warn that member states unable or unwilling to shift away from Russian energy could become weak links in the bloc's unified approach to Moscow. In the coming days and weeks, the United States and Hungary are expected to continue negotiations on the exemption request and potentially to announce cooperation deals in energy, industry and defence. Key indicators to watch include any formal US decision on the exemption, whether conditional or full, any Hungarian commitments to alternative energy sources or supply diversification, and how EU institutions respond to any deviation from the bloc's collective sanctions posture. As for the bilateral relationship, the meeting underscores its strengthened personal dimension. Trump and Orban have cultivated a close bond, and Hungary recently had its status in the US visa waiver program fully restored. The energy dialogue now presents a test of how far that personal rapport translates into policy outcomes and whether it will shape geopolitical and economic alignments in Central Europe, US. President Donald Trump and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban met at the White House on November 7 to discuss Hungary's request for exemption from US sanctions on Russian oil. Trump acknowledged Hungary's geographic energy constraints, saying, "We are looking at it, but made no immediate decision." Hungary remains heavily reliant on Russian oil and gas, and the exemption issue places the US sanctions regime at a potential inflection point. The talks may yield energy and economic cooperation deals, and their outcome could influence both US policy toward Russia and Hungary's domestic and regional energy strategy. The situation remains in flux as both capitals negotiate the terms and conditions of any relief, while allies and institutions await further signals.